Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, thanks to all the organisers for giving a chance to contribute. I just want to say I'm Australian. I'm not Pacific Islander, but I am based in Suva, Fiji, and I've been here for about a bit over 6 years. Yeah, thanks for Professor Baker also for mentioning Fiji has just gone back, well, I say 1 month now, maybe, back into fairly hard lockdown. After about 10 months of relatively good mobility. And yeah, the issue was because in the quarantine, one of the soldiers who looks after the quarantine guests had somehow been transmitted to it. And, you know, in Pacific Island countries, we're very communal, and there's lots of informal settlements in the capital areas. And there's also, yeah, the culture is many extended families all in the one place. There's sharing of cups to drink kava in. And so, yeah, we're very vulnerable. So just having said that, I want to wind back a little bit and share with you some of my research that I've done on culture in the Pacific. And this was done pre-COVID, but I want to use that as sort of, you know, sort of a platform to talk about how tourism might look going forward in the Pacific. So let me just share my screen. Oh.
Well done, it worked.
Am I sharing? Oh yeah, okay. Sorry. Okay, so yeah, so the paper was called Globalisation and Cultural Change in Pacific Island Countries, and I was working with Dr. Dennis Tolkach. He's now based in James Cook University. So, you know, I'll go through fairly quickly some of the things that we're quite well aware of. So, you know, culture plays a major role in tourism and for tourism. It's a major tourism attraction, especially in the Pacific, and it has the ability to preserve and revive cultural practices. But there's also the downside of tourism on culture. And some of these have been highlighted in the literature before, things like cultural appropriation, misappropriation, the commodification of culture. And this has been discussed, you know, quite extensively. Some photos of, I think this is in Tonga, where, yeah, where some of the students are learning as part of their curriculum, you know, weaving and the traditional handicrafts. Okay, so I want to define culture. It means lots of different things to lots of different people. So it's saying it's behavior or beliefs that are learned and shared. Learned so that it's not instinctual, but also that it's not individual. So I'm focusing on the sort of cultural part, the social sharing part. It's not limited to geographic borders, but it's a common experience. And also looking at globalization, of course, that means many things to many people. Generally, people argue that it's shaped by technological change that involves some sort of refiguration of nation states and involves regionalization. And I'm looking at it from a cultural perspective. So defining it as a social process in which the constraints and geography on social and cultural arrangements recede, and people are increasingly aware that they're receding. Okay, so the objectives of the research was to examine this cultural change on Pacific Island countries due to globalization. And it wasn't just, it was looking at the idea of not only tourism, but what are some of the other factors, and to what extent is it tourism, to what extent is it these other factors. Looking at the Pacific Island countries, of course, South Pacific is home to many diverse cultures, and of course, tourism is one of the major forms. And some people have argued, especially during the pandemic, that there's been over-reliance on some of the Pacific Island countries on tourism. So I want to look at, you know, without getting too academic, to try to look at globalization from three different paradigms, if you want to say it. So, you know, the relationship between culture and globalization can be due to this clash of cultures. Often this was the idea of the Western culture, which has traditionally been, I guess you could say, the dominant world culture. and non-Western cultures. And then the idea of this sort of the other end of the scale, this idea of McDonaldization, where there's a standardization and commodification of culture. And then there's somewhere in between this hybridization, things like globalization, it's sometimes called, where cultures are dynamic. They're not static, and they evolve and they change over time. So just to flesh out some of the issues, so clash of civilizations, this idea that culture is used as a logical tool, and so in the past it's been looked at the West versus the rest, and the rest is depending on the context being either Asia or Soviet Union or Islam. And so this idea of clash of cultures, it's fairly self-explanatory, is where cultures are bumping up against each other and causing some problems. In terms of tourism, some people have argued that tourism is this new form of colonialism, that the periphery is often in developed countries and being visited by the developed world as their sort of playground. The idea of McDonaldization is that there's a homogenization of cultures throughout the world, and usually this is the idea of Americanization, and this is built on the ideas of efficiency, on predictability, that it's quite controlled and manufactured. And this has happened. Some people have argued that cruise tourism is a form of this, that it's highly rationalized and maybe it's an inauthentic experience. And then we get to this idea of hybridization, where there's this blurring, crossing over of cultures, globalization or local globalization. And so again, there's examples in tourism, especially related around food. Festival and events showcase different cultures, especially from the diaspora. And so you've probably seen, a McDonald's in your own, in a different country to let's say the US, where the menu's been sort of localized, if you want to say it like that. Okay, so we did some 50 interviews in Fiji, in Tonga, and in Cook Islands. So we found these three different types of paradigms occurring. So there was clashes of culture. So this was the idea of a demonstration effect, the idea that the local cultures will copy or imitate sort of the tourist culture. And so, the clashes were often based on sometimes on cultural or religious grounds. So especially in the Cook Islands, they were flying on a Sunday, and the Sabbath being a day of rest. Some locals didn't like the fact that flights were operating on these on the Sabbath. Or there was more sort of like the needs of the tourism industry versus the traditional obligations. So, tourists sort of expect, I guess, some service around the week. They saved up, having their holidays here, and that can clash against some traditional obligations. For example, a funeral of a relative. So here's the quote: "There's a phenomenon here. People will produce enough to meet some specific need. They don't mind doing a little bit extra every day or a month or a particular part of the year, but they won't engage in a workshop production because they've got enough money to satisfy their needs, and then they stop. The market's not dominant. They engage in the market to meet a particular need, rather than so they're not wage slaves. They're not lazy. They have a very sensible attitude to work-life balance. Work and money, it is not everything. So that can be somewhat problematic. I'll move on. So there was also ongoing suspicions of foreign interests in the Pacific. They want our fishing rights. They're suspicious of Spanish, Chinese, Taiwanese, Japanese coming here, said one accommodation owner in the Cook Islands. There was also modernization. This is the idea of Moana, the film. So, it's reduced to a Pacific culture, whereas, there's many different elements of the Pacific, and this idea of homogenization of culture. And we see sometimes this in some dancing in the Pacific. So they might have, Tahitian sort of dancing, as well as the Fijian meke, and this is all sort of mixed up. Some people say it's, it's ubiquitous. Keep going. And there's also some, migration. So Bulanization of the Cook Islands. So Bula, of course, means hello in Fijian, and there's lots of mobility. Now we have Filipino staff and Fijians working in the Cook Islands, and so you know, when you have your holiday in the Cook Islands, is it an authentic experience or not? You know, being served by people not from the Cook Islands. But then some say, well, you know, the loss of culture might have been worse without tourism. So you know, some of these cultural activities are performed and maintained mainly because of the tourist dollar, said one academic from Tonga. Hybridisation, well, it recognises that cultures evolve. And so there's contrasting opinions. At the same time, they don't want to lose out on these traditions, but also embrace the modernisation and the connectedness to the world. Some people worried that the pace of change might be too fast, that mobilities and technology have a role to play. You know, that the diaspora, you know, have an influence, that, you know, everything's on social media now, and you know, people can find out the latest trends and the globalized trends. But, you know, the dilemma is that how to keep your culture unique as well. So the idea of, I mean, this is an interesting quote, the idea of what is authentic. So someone in the public sector, Cook Islands, said, we didn't wear skimpy clothes on the road 20 years ago. That was not seen. But now the tourists come in with their swim tops because maybe it's hot or how they feel. It's accepted now. I know there's been notices in accommodation areas and in tourism pamphlets asking for tourists not to wear anything too revealing. Once upon a time, we were not wearing clothes, and the Christian missionaries came and told us, you've got to cover yourself. And then later later on they come with no clothes on. So yeah, quite amusing sort of observation there. So who decides? Well, culture's evolving, and it's going to evolve, you know, in a post-COVID world as well. One thing that did come out was the agency that that Pacific Islanders had, that they're not passive. They, you know, they're astute with understanding their culture, with understanding globalization, and they're not a victim of the process. So cultures evolve, geopolitics and market changes have to be considered. There's also recognition of a loss of languages, and here at the University of the South Pacific, there's, amongst other places, there's been a revival of vernacular languages being taught. And so this idea of tourism was to some extent played down by participants. They recognize that tourism is impactful, but not the only influence. So lots of things impacting Pacific cultures, and you know, further research can be done to see how cultures evolve under these different pressures, and especially COVID-19. So some comments on culture tourism and cultural tourism in a COVID-19 era. So I think there's what's really come out with discussions amongst tourism stakeholders in the Pacific is it's the importance of the local community, and just really having a voice like it hasn't had in the past, or hasn't had as much in the past. And so I think this is really important. And you know, the idea that you know, tourists are wanting still authentic experiences. Again, that, you know, that was here pre-COVID, and I think it's only going to be stronger in post-COVID. But here's the challenges. You know, we're seeing that people, tourists, are wanting nature. You know, not to go somewhere so crowded. So maybe it's just the environment, but rather than the people and the culture. And so maybe that you know, that winds back a little bit about you know, the good things about tourism and the social and cultural interactions between them. The tourists want to go off the beaten path. It's also, you know, been raised again by Professor Baker, but also by Vinip and Matteo. You know, the idea of these vulnerable populations and what risk levels are populations willing to you know, are willing to accept. And you know, I know before this last wave in Fiji that I know that you know, expats that were coming in. That you know, were coming in for on work permits. Some of them had you know, vaccinations from the US, and they were still required to do the 14-day quarantining. So you know, there's still, I guess, this level of trust will need to you know, be built up, and I guess you know, evidence from the medical professionals will need to be demonstrated. We're also hearing, you know, on the ground here, also hearing, you know, the idea of vaccine hesitancy. And so, you know, I speak to some people and they say, well, look, I don't work in the tourism industry. I don't work in frontline. I'm not going to meet tourists. I live on I might live on one of the outer islands. I don't work in tourism. I live on one of the outer islands. Why do I need to get vaccinated? I have some suspicion about it. And so, that's the next step. Even if the vaccines are available, which they're not really disproportionately available. So the latest stats, I think, in Fiji, we have a population of almost 900,000. And I think in terms of first vaccinations, up to about 120,000 people vaccinated. So Fiji compared to, is sort of a more developed country or more, and more, has more access to, to Australia, New Zealand, and elsewhere in the world than other small island developing states, Tuvalu, Kiribati. So, again, as Professor Perry showed, that we really are somewhat behind in, in a level playing field. So, what can I say going forward? I think the industry will be, quite different going forward. I think we'll see a lot more high value, low volume tourism, and I think that's going to have impacts on, the human resources. So, especially in Fiji, we have we have international branded hotels, 200, 300, up to 400 rooms, resorts. I think some of these, larger resorts are really going to struggle. They're the ones that employ the most people, but they're also the ones that are going to be most vulnerable. We're seeing already, before this last wave, we're seeing some high value tourism. So, you can Google it if you don't know, but let's say a well-known company that has a search engine, has pretty much taken over a lease of an island, one of the small islands, and paying for the staff to be pretty much in a bubble. So they've been there. I think they first came with about 6 months lease, and then they've extended that to 12 months, and I think they've taken it over. So and they're paying top dollar, but they're not interacting with the wider community. So this is the to some extent the way I see tourism. Thank you.
Good. Thanks, Stephen, and thanks for reminding us that it's not only a question of tourists crossing borders to exceed touristic sites, but also the problem of the local population who may be exposed also to a sanitary risk, and the way to cope with that.